Professor Laird here. This is a supplement to the political ideologies class. I wanted to back up and do a little bit of pre-modern history to kind of a setup to our next lectures, where we're going to be talking about the origin of democracy and then the origin of concepts such as liberalism. So let's back up a little bit here and talk about how our brain evolved to a certain extent, and then even perhaps more importantly, as far as the setup goes for this class, is how the modern state formed, which kind of set the stage for all of this that happened after it. So it took until about 6 million years ago before our pre-modern humans separated away from the other primate groups, and it was a few million years after that where our earliest known forerunner to Homo sapiens was discovered, and then about 2.5 million years ago, oldest known stone tool. So you can see that something's happening there with respect to our particular pre-modern human line there, where when we come out of the trees, we stand upright, we begin to use our hands, our brain starts to develop, we form tools. And then 1.5 million years ago, earliest evidence of fire. Of course, these are rough estimates here as far as what some of the theories are. And then obviously with fire, we would have other benefits from that for social gathering, which actually improved our brains as well, that social interaction, as well as eating cooked food, which aided in our digestion, which allowed more calories to be used for brain development, things such as that. Throughout this period, we're undergoing the process known as natural selection, which increases the frequency of adaptive traits through time. And when you look at from about 2.5 million years ago to about 100,000 years ago, that's 96,000 generations of where the most adaptive traits would continue to prolong themselves. So this variation is that every species is composed of a great variety of individuals, and this heritability is that the offspring inherit traits from their parents to some degree. So these most successful traits keep getting passed on to the next generation. So this natural selection, described as a differential reproductive process. Better adapted individuals generally produce more offspring than poorly adapted individuals, and the frequency of these adaptive traits gradually increase in subsequent generations. So that's what's happening as we go. The benefits that we come up with as pre-modern humans continue to be perpetuated and improved upon. So when did we actually become fully human? There's a big debate over that. As recently as 150,000 years ago, human DNA has already traced all humans on the earth to the same common ancestors, a relatively small group of hunter-gatherers in North Central Africa, somewhere around that region. Around 115,000 years ago, Ice Age ensued. Modern human migration might have begun before that through things such as seagoing vessels and other types of migration, but the Ice Age also provided some advantages for migration because of ice bridges and lowered sea levels. This period here of the Ice Age, which lasted almost 100,000 years, human beings migrated to all the far corners of the world. So the migration out of Africa began for the most part, or was facilitated much more during that period. And then around 50,000 years ago, we start to see evidence of human beings acting like humans, modern humans, with signs of culture. At that point, we determined that perhaps our spoken language had fully developed. And at that point, once we're able to communicate more effectively, our brains kicked into the next level and we're able to do more things with our thinking. This perfection of spoken language suggests a rapid genetic reorganization of the human brain, and then we start to see the appearance of new, more sophisticated type weapons, more refined tools, ivory needles and thread, even art, paintings, jewelry, fashion, music, dance, rituals such as funerals. Around this time, started to develop into what we would consider modern human beings. And around 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. Humans were migrated to all areas of the earth. The sea levels rose back up. Ice bridges went away. And we kind of separated into our own separate cultures at that point. And then, of course, a question comes up at this point right here. At this time, I would ask in the classroom setting, what is the single most important innovation or discovery primarily responsible for modern human civilizations? And that's where I give you a chance to brainstorm that. But the answer is basically farming, agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, the benefits that provided for humans to come together and build communities. It cannot be overestimated how important that is in order to create what we consider our modern human civilization. Once human beings were able to settle and establish roots, no pun intended there, but prior to that, humans were basically foragers, hunter-gatherers, some herders. Now that we are able to establish a community and grow, we started to see the population would intensify, which brought numerous benefits as far as social interaction and creation of different rules and institutions, as well as disease resistance. The ability to create a surplus created all sorts of incentives as well as necessities as to what to do with that surplus, whether to store it or protect it or trade it. And as a result of that, we had more human specialization, other jobs other than just hunting or gathering, which prior to that we only basically had two jobs, hunting and gathering. Now we have all types of specialization, division of labor, things to do to serve this growing community. So what we have here then is a complex society. Welcome to modern human civilization. Around 5,000 years ago, one of the first organized civilizations, Egypt, united by the pharaohs. This was in the area where the Fertile Crescent, climate would settled into the four seasons after the Ice Age. There's been some shift of climate since then, but the first modern civilizations were around where that agriculture could grow. And even though this Egypt empire here is not considered the same as what we call the modern state, which is what we'll get into here in a few minutes, but it was the first big organized community, found enormous benefits as a result. About 3,000 years ago, or 1,000 years BC, the Zhou dynasty in what is now in the region of China came up with other institutions, such as tax collection, flood control, road building. Roman Republic was founded. The contribution of the Greeks was enormous, particularly with math and geometry in this period, 600 to 200. Thales, Pythagoras, Archimedes, Euclid, their contributions even to this day are almost incalculable. Around 117 CE, the Roman Empire was at its largest. It was by this time no longer a republic, turning into an empire. Around 600 Common Era, Germanic tribes had carved Western Europe into what is roughly modern Europe as far as the cultural identities there that were breaking up in this region. And we'll be focusing on Western Europe here primarily because this is where these ideas came out of as far as political philosophy, moral philosophy, as well as where the first modern state had formed. This is a map where the major division between the Roman Catholic Holy Roman Empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church there. Again, we'll be focusing on the Western European region here in a few minutes as to where this modern state first formed. So let's get into that. The formation of the modern state, which came out of the Western Europe region, and again, the United States is a product of Western European expansionism. We were part of that. We'll get into this a little bit more detail here in a second, but the institutions, I've already touched on a few of them, had been evolving for a long time in this region, as well as other regions of the world, but most particularly as to what's going to come out of the Western European region. We see courts of law, jury trials, estate management, as far as property ownership or property management, record keeping, and bureaucracy, tax collection, and then basic bureaucratic functions, which are necessary for an organized community, an organized society. By the year 1215 in England, the Magna Carta, one of the first major documents that kind of takes us to the next level, was that it reaffirmed individual rights. Still had a ways to go. Also put limits on royal power in that the Magna Carta established a council of barons, which were the noblemen of that particular region, a council of barons that would actually have some say on policy along with the king. But this council of barons is the forerunner to the parliament, which became the legislative body of England and the British Empire, and also is the model for our American Congress. So as you can see, it goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. Now, the feudalist system was one that had developed over a long period of time in these large multi-ethnic empires over an expansive territory. The best that a king or an emperor could do would have a lot of barons and nobles that would be in charge of the property, and then everyone else was peasants and workers and serfs that would work the land. And it was rough life. It was you were born into nobility, otherwise you are going to be a worker. Though the decline of feudalism around this period from around 1300 to 1500 is instrumental in that opened the door for the breakup of the Western European region, along with the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, Protestant Reformation. These all, big, huge synergistic stew that kind of came together during these centuries that opened the door for our modern state system and these other forms of government. But over this 200-year period, feudalism pretty much broke apart, and there were several factors that go into this. Not any one single factor did it, but a series of factors. For example, the plague, bubonic plague in the late 1300s that wiped out as much as 80% of the population in some regions there, but it was incredibly devastating. And what the plague did was it wiped out so many people that it made the value of labor go up, that workers had a little bit more leverage, that there wasn't as many of them. So that increased the value of labor, gave them a little bit more say in the operation of this system. Also at this time, more innovation was coming into play as far as mass production, trade opportunities, more innovations as far as crop rotations and methods to improve efficiency. Now, of course, money had been around for a long time, but currencies were also being used to pay people for their labor rather than having them live off your land and run your land. So it actually became more efficient and more productive to pay somebody for a day's work rather than provide for them on your land while they run the land for you. So there's lots of things going on here during this period that start to see the decline and eventual breakup of the feudal system. As a result of these innovations and the prospect of having people work for wages and buy products with their wages, the merchants, the merchant class, also known as the burgher class, began to become more important. They started to supersede the nobles as far as in the king's favor. So we start to see a shift more towards, this is the forerunners of capitalism as well in this region. The merchants became more prominent, more valuable in the eyes of the empire there than the nobles did. Other innovations were coming up at this time, defense systems such as gunpowder and cannons. These types of technologies were more conducive to protecting a more manageable territory, because prior to this, we had these huge multi-expansive empires, multi-ethnic empires that could pretty much only be managed by sending troops out on horseback, and they come back many, many months later and say, well, how did that go? What was the status of that conquest out there? As a result of all of this happening, the feudal system began to break up, and the Western European region starts to fracture into what we call these more territorially defined authorities, as opposed to these multi-ethnic, large, expansive empires. So the Protestant Reformation also facilitated part of this as well. We're going to get into that in more detail when we talk about how the breakup of the Roman Empire, the Reformation, kind of paved the way for more ideas that led to democracy and liberalism. As a result of this formation of these territorially defined authorities, they broke along ethnic lines. The French, the Italians, the Belgians, the Danish, the English, the Germans, the Belgians, they all broke up along their own tribal ethnic lines. But because of the innovation and the opportunities and this political competition was fierce, they went into this really hyper-competitive mode, exploration, conquest, looking for resources, the technology that they were able to develop with their sailing ships. The amount of development was extreme, the hyper-development, the amount of competition between these growing powers in this Western European region was pretty intense and pretty dramatic, as well as the creativity that was coming out, the openness of new thinking. The Renaissance was also part of this stew that created more ideas on how to be successful. And as a result, there was a lot of conflict as well. 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War. In the European region there was a lot of competition for power, for resources. The system of mercantilism was used to go out and conquer other areas around the world. These states in this region, they weren't necessarily called states yet, but were on the cusp of that. These powers were able to dominate the rest of the world for over 400 years because they could. And they were delegated out to bring home the resources from areas all around the world. But there was also a lot of competition and conflict, wars, fighting, within the region. And the Treaty of Westphalia is somewhat of a landmark as well in 1648, where they established this concept of sovereignty, to where we're going to recognize that this is your territory with defined authority, and everything within that territory is your business. You take care of your business, and I'll take care of my business. And that is the concept of sovereignty that we still go by today. So you could say that the Treaty of Westphalia was somewhat of the formal beginning of our modern state system, but it took a couple of hundred years of this breakup and formation of these territorially defined authorities to put that in place. And at the same time, Thomas Hobbes, who we'll be talking about in more detail later on, he was also a political, moral philosopher, very much ahead of his time, was talking about this concept of the common power, these states that were starting to form. And he was one of the first philosophers to acknowledge that human beings, it's at the heart of the individual. The humanity is based on the individual, not the king, telling everybody else what to do. But he's also saying that human beings are naturally self-interested, competitive creatures. And unless we sacrifice some of our freedom to this new common power, he called it Leviathan, that was the name of his very influential work that he wrote at this time. Unless human beings are willing to come in together to a social contract and sacrifice some of their freedom to this common power, well, life is going to continue to be nasty, brutish, and short, in his quotes there that are famously coming out of that work. So all this was happening about that same time. So the concept of sovereignty, the formation of these states that become the template for a modern state system, to where they have established borders, and everybody recognizes that that's your border. Everybody within those borders are your citizens. Then you start to establish a national identity. And this is also very important as well, because human beings start to shift their loyalty. They start to shift it from their family. They start to shift it from their tribe. They shift their loyalty from their religion in general to this new national identity that is going to be protecting them from foreign enemies, protecting them from nature, as well as protecting them from themselves, as Hobbes had already hinted at. So the concept of a national identity, a bond that brings people together, being socialized into this territorially defined authority. So this is where we see the modern state system forming, and the people within these territories are delegating the authority to protect these institutions that have been forming for centuries. Protect our courts, protect our trials, our juries, our rule of law, our bureaucratic functions, the tax collecting. Protect those, and we give you the authority to do that. So this is where the modern state has pretty much formed, and here is the timeline that I've attached with it. As you can see, institutions had long been forming as we get into the Middle Ages, where the feudal system is the order of the day, with nobles, fiefdoms, commoners, peasants, serfs, Holy Roman Empire in the Western European region, emperors, popes, kings. But then feudalism starts to decline, break apart. We talked about those reasons right there. And as feudalism declines, we also see other things starting to happen. Protestant Reformation. People start to come together into these territorially defined authorities. And then with the Treaty of Westphalia, we start to see the modern state form. And that system begins to settle in, because it creates this concept of nationalism, where the people can delegate the monopoly of the defense onto their leaders. The elite norms start to establish the principles of that particular state, and then you start to cultivate a civil society. The Constitution, which we'll talk about later on, represents somewhat of a culmination of all of this Enlightenment thinking for the previous couple of hundred years before that. And then the state system settles in, it sticks, it's a more efficient organization for extracting resources. This is my territory. For economic relations, these are my products. I can decide to trade with another system and then use them for the benefit of our system. And again, the monopoly over that use of force also results in somewhat of a pacification of society, because human beings can now worry about their own lives rather than protecting themselves from threats. So that is going to wrap up the supplemental lecture here on the formation of the modern state. I wanted to kind of set the stage for these next lectures. They're going to talk about where this democratic ideal came from, and then we start to come up with ideologies such as liberalism and then conservatism coming out of that. So stay tuned for the discussion forum, and then next chapter will be continuing on with our historical overview.